thanks to the women's movement, women have a constitutional right to get an abortion. That was an achievement. But in large swaths of the country, Republican legislatures are erecting spurious barriers to getting one, so that de facto, women living in certain places cannot exercise their constitutional right. In some Republican states, the equal voting rights of African Americans, the crowning achievement of the civil rights movement 50 years ago, are steadily being eroded through gerrymandering and the manipulation of voting hours. And in other states, progressive gay rights legislation passed at the local level is being overturned by Republican legislatures and governors. Liberals have had only 2 Democratic presidents since the Reagan era. But the truth of their administrations is that they were stymied at almost every turn by rabidly right-wing Republicans in Congress and in state offices, not to mention the Supreme Court. And this situation is only getting worse. Today, Republicans hold 2/3 of the state houses in this country and 2/3 of the state legislatures. They control 24 out of 50 states outright. Democrats control only 7. And radical right billionaires like the Koch brothers are pouring money today into state races. That for them, this is the new frontier. And as a result, unions and public schools are now under severe attack. And if Republicans gain 1 or 2 more state legislatures, they could conceivably call a constitutional convention. Now just think for a minute about what that would mean, a constitutional convention in the age of Donald Trump for the rights of African Americans, women, and gays. It's no longer time to talk about making future gains. We live in an age of rollback, and that's what needs to be focused on. That means that the greatest proximate threat to the gains made by social movements over the past 50 years is not white supremacy or sexism or homophobia any more than it is the fall in the Garden of Eden. The present danger is a hyper-radical and institutionally powerful Republican Party, and they acquired their party through their power through electoral politics, not movement politics. I am a liberal speaking to or addressing myself to fellow liberals. And tonight I'll use the word liberal as a catch-all phrase for anyone left of center all the way over to progressives and beyond. Because our universities are dominated by liberals and liberal ideas, we sometimes forget that there are other points of view. And we speak of politics in the classroom and elsewhere in a way that presumes that all moral, right-thinking people agree with us. We don't even perceive how partisan we are, and therefore have trouble understanding why many Americans find us smug. The Once and Future Liberal is about politics, and therefore about power. In the book, I sketch a history recounting how a once vibrant liberal tradition lost its hold on the American imagination. I then draw some lessons from that history, and I conclude by offering some tentative suggestions, very tentative, about what we might do differently to regain power and accomplish the things that we profess to want. And that's all my book sets out to do. My premise is the following: that you cannot help anyone in American politics over the long term unless you maintain a durable hold on institutional power. And by institutional power, I mean holding public offices responsible for making and enforcing the law. Of course, institutional politics is not the only way to practice politics. There's movement politics. And there was a time in our recent history, not so long ago, I'd say from the late 50s up until around the early 80s, when social movements were the only thing making the American system budge. There were issue-based movements like those against the Vietnam War or to protect the environment. And there were what we call now identity-based ones for the rights of African Americans and other ethnic minorities, for women and for gays. And it can't be denied that thanks to these latter movements, the country is a more tolerant, more just, and more inclusive place than it was 50 years ago. I know because, sad to say, I was there. But that period is over. And in fact, it's been over for decades. The truth is that since the Reagan years, the overall balance of political power in the United States has not been greatly affected by social movements. Movements have continued to make advances on particular issues, gay marriage, for example. And our culture, just the way we deal with each other, even how businesses operate, those things have been transformed by social movements. There's no doubt about that. And it's something that conservatives complain about bitterly. But for more than 3 decades now, changes in the structure of political power, in the sense I mean it, in this country, have been determined almost wholly by the gains and losses of our 2 major political parties. And there is a deep lesson in this. It is that in America, institutional politics can always, at some point, undo whatever gains are made through movement politics. This is an inconvenient truth that movement activists would prefer to ignore. But it's hard to ignore if you're actually paying attention to politics across the country, and not just in Washington, D.C., and certainly not just on campuses. If you look at the states where Republicans hold undisputed power today, you will see what happens to movement gains in the face of institutional power. So that's my premise. The primacy of institutional politics over movement politics, not always, but at this moment in our history.
And last question, thank you.
Hi, so I'm wondering, I feel like a lot of what you say in terms of advocating for this separation between identity and politics, to be quite frank, I find it to be very troubling, and it personally bothers me, because I think that for marginalized communities in this country, policies like, for example, in my community, for the Muslim ban or the Muslim Brotherhood Designation Act, these policies have real and tangible effects on people in my community, and they translate into real and tangible violence. And I'm wondering to what extent you believe that what you're saying is emblematic of your own privileges as ostensibly a white man.
Okay, so here we go.
Okay, the P word has come up. Well, I'll just answer that you have to be very, it needs to be said in universities, unless you know someone well and their lives, you know nothing about them. You know nothing about what they've been through. You don't know their life experiences, and you cannot presume to judge anything about their privilege on the basis of a social category. That out of the way, you ask a great question. And give me an example now to explain what I'm talking about. Something like the Muslim ban is a great example of where, and Donald Trump's handling of it, where, in other words, where he's dissing Muslim Americans and dissing people whose children have fought for this country and died for this country, right? Why should that upset me? Should that upset me because I have a deep understanding of Muslim American life? I'm a busy guy, I might not have that. But he is dissing American citizens. They are being treated differently on the basis of their religion and the countries they come from, and that is outrageous. And if you have planted in people's minds 2 basic principles, which gets back to what we were talking about before, solidarity and equal protection under the law are the two things I mentioned in the book. I think just about every liberal cause can be put under one of those two categories. And this would be a case of equal protection under the laws and solidarity. That I have a stake as a citizen in the fact that people in your community and maybe even members of your family are not being treated equally in this country. And unless I think of you as a citizen and not just a person from a faraway place in another group, I'm not going to be moved. And so what I'm concerned with is building a kind of civic education where kids learn this in school, that you need, that by virtue of all Americans should matter to you. Now, you also need to understand them, just to understand the diversity of America. It makes you a smarter, richer person to learn. All of that is all good. But I need something to appeal to. And those two principles seem to work for me. And I think Bernie Sanders is appealing to those, because there has to be a principle behind class. You can't just say, I'm appealing to class. Well, okay, there are classes. Now motivate me to action. What motivates me to action is that if there are class disparities among Americans, I'm against it. If there are serious harms caused by class distinctions, I don't want my fellow citizens to experience that. And it goes back to the four freedom speech of Roosevelt. Freedom of religion, freedom of thought, freedom from want, and freedom from fear. Doesn't get any better than that.